You need a translation from Chinese to English or English to Chinese?
都会说英文对吗？
对，都会说英文。
我的英文比我的中文好。
好，那等一下，麦克会有一个短短的演讲，那大概10几分钟吧。那我会一边放这个中文的这个字幕，那这是我多准备，因为我不确定今天会不会有人需要。那时间好像差不多了。好，那我们就开始。大家好，我是大块文化的编辑陈孝普。那今天非常高兴可以邀请到齐迈可到现场跟我们分享这本新书《中国任务》。那齐迈可他为了报道他热爱的中国议题，他跟中共交手了超过30年。那他只为了要理解并传达在中国看到的真相。那他代表作之一是在1989年的一个直播。那个时候他克服了各种技术上和这个政府管制上的障碍，及时转播了天安门广场的画面到全世界。那这在当时是一件非常非常不容易的事情。那这个成就也帮他带来了艾美奖、杜邦哥伦比亚大学广播电视新闻奖、皮博迪奖等大奖。那他现在是世界上相当这个有分量的中国专家。但是这个近代中国不是只有天安门事件。那另一方面，虽然齐迈可他是一位顶尖的记者，但是这个80年来还是有上百位非常杰出的美国记者，他也试着在这个非常复杂又非常封闭的国家挖掘真相。那这些记者的经历都非常精彩，但是在过去这几年来，一直都没有人把它做系统性的整理。那所以这个是这本书或者这个计划的一个开始的这个一部分。那这本书中国任务美国驻华记者口述史是我们大块文化出版。那它是延伸自2017年齐迈可的一个作品，它是协助这个南加州大学的美中学院制作的一个同名纪录片，叫《中国任务》。但是因为纪录片它有很多这个时间上的限制，所以有很多精彩的故事要被删除。那另外一个方面，因为这个纪录片推出以后，中国的局势又有很剧烈的变化，包括2019年的香港反送中运动，那2020年的 COVID-19 疫情，所以这本书它多了很多纪录片里面被删掉的片段之外，它还有额外超过20则的访谈。那今天齐迈可会来跟我们介绍他这部作品。那齐迈可他是这个哥伦比亚大学中国研究学系毕业，然后取得哥伦比亚大学新闻学院硕士学位。那他的这个经历非常丰富，他在这个哥伦比亚广播公司工作的期间，他移居到香港，那在那个地方报道中国议题。那等一下他可能会解释为什么在香港报道中国议题。那他也是这个首任的 CNN 的这个北京分社社长，那也是协助 CNN 创立香港分社。那他曾经访问过的人也非常多，包括中国前国家主席江泽民、北韩前领导人金日成、南韩前总统金大中，还有陈水扁、马英九、蔡英文这些国内政要。那他也报道过阿富汗战争、中国崛起、香港主权移交、第一次波斯湾战争、南亚大海啸。他也报道过南韩、北韩、印度、巴基斯坦、台湾还有其他地区的政治发展。那他的身份也非常多，他除了是学者、教授、作家以外，他也是电影制作人。那目前他的台湾就业金卡现在住在台湾。那等一下演讲结束之后，会有这个我们留了非常长的时间让大家跟齐迈可互动，那就请大家不用客气。那我现在会把这个书传下去，那大家可以稍微瞄一下这本书大概长什么样。这个书的这个形式非常非常特别。我刚拿到这本书的时候，我想说，第一个问题不是这个怎么编，第一个问题是我要怎么看这本书。因为这本书的这个格式就是非常的特殊，它几乎整本书都是用这个各个记者的这个访谈的这个记录，就比如说什么记者说了什么话，什么记者说了什么话。所以开始看就说，这个是在看这个舞台剧的剧本吗？怎么跟我以前看过的书这么不一样？那接下来才想说，这本书应该怎么编的，可以让它可以比较好的方式呈现出来。那这是一个非常非常好看的书。一开始看的时候可能不太确定说该怎么看这本书，但是后来看一看，会觉得非常像在看一本纪录片。就是这个谁说了什么话，然后会有个旁白帮忙介绍这个地方发生什么事，然后记者一个一个讲，所以是非常非常有趣的一本书。那现在这个传下去，那大家可以稍微看一下这长什么样子。那我们现在请齐迈可来开始他的演讲，谢谢大家。
谢谢。Well, if you don't mind, I'll speak English, 因为我太老了，脑子。So let me tell you a little bit about the background to the book, and then I want to talk a little bit about the content of the book. For most consumers of news, for people who watch the news or read the news or listen to the news, the way the stories that you see or hear or read actually get there remains kind of a mystery. Few people really understand what goes into the reporting, the writing, the researching, and the transmitting of news. In other words, what the experience of actually going out and being a journalist is like. That's true in most places, but it's especially true in China. And yet, if you ask any journalist, the process, the way in which the news is reported, shapes virtually any news report. And again, this is true all over the world, but it's especially true in relation to China, because here journalists have struggled to understand a very complicated society with a very secretive political system, a very long and complicated history, and they have faced pressure from the government in Beijing. Sometimes they faced pressure from their own government in Washington, and they also face pressure from their editors, from their bosses, and also just the demands of the profession, the deadline, the need to use technology. So all of these factors go into shaping what a news report is like. So now today, China has become a kind of emerging superpower, and relations between China and the US are really the worst that they've been in 50 years. So to understand the people who are covering China, especially for the American media, I think, and how they have done so and how they are doing it now, is really crucial to help people like you understand the news that you watch on TV or that you read in the newspaper or online and listen to the radio. And providing that understanding to give people an idea of what it's like to actually do this work is the goal of Assignment China. It's why we did the 12-part documentary film series, and it's why I produced this book. So, the story of Assignment China begins with the triumph of Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949. At that point, virtually all American and other Western reporters were forced to leave China. And for most of the 30 years that followed, American reporters and other Western reporters had little choice but to follow China from outside China, and that was most notably from Hong Kong. They became known as China Watchers, and they couldn't go to China. So sitting outside, they had to rely on the official Chinese media, which they monitored carefully, looking for clues in the way in which the official Chinese propaganda presented whatever the subject was. They also interviewed refugees who were coming into Hong Kong from China, and there were still some, not very many, but there were still a few foreign visitors who went to the mainland, and so they would try to interview them as well. But it was a very frustrating assignment, and especially when China faced upheavals like the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, or the Cultural Revolution, Wenhua in the mid-1960s. There were huge events happening in China, but the correspondents couldn't get there and see for themselves. They were stuck outside. And it was actually, I don't think it's in the notes that you put, there's a wonderful quote from an American China watcher talking about covering the Cultural Revolution, and he said it was like a struggle of sea monsters deep below the surface of the water. And you knew there was a struggle because these bubbles would come up to the surface, but you had no idea what the sea monsters were fighting about. And I think that captures the challenge of trying to figure out China then. So it was really not until President Richard Nixon's historic trip to China in 1972 that the door began to open. At that time, China had been cut off from the West for so long that many of the journalists that I interviewed for Assignment China described going to China with Nixon as like going to another solar system, going to the moon, going to another planet. It was so different. But in the wake of the Nixon trip, China did begin to become slightly more open to American and other Western media. And there is a chapter in the book that talks about the period after Nixon's trip and before Chairman Mao's death, when slowly there was a little bit more access. But it wasn't really until the U.S. and China opened official diplomatic relations in 1979 that American news organizations were finally allowed to open bureaus in Beijing. And from then on, the overall size of the American and foreign press corps was allowed to grow in China. So what followed were several decades when the People's Republic became increasingly accessible to American and foreign journalists. But even with this opening, there were always obstacles and limitations. One example, when I became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief in 1987, the official rules were that if you wanted to travel outside Beijing, you had to get permission in writing in advance 10 days before any trip. You had to write to the Waibon, the Foreign Affairs Office of wherever you went, and explain what you wanted to do. And sometimes they would say yes, and you could go, and sometimes they would say no, and you couldn't go. And if you did get permission, you always had a government minder, a guide, an official guide, and you had to pay for the guide even though you didn't want him. But you had to pay for this guide who would take you around and make the arrangements and also make sure you didn't do anything they didn't want you to do. And that meant that contact with ordinary Chinese people was extremely difficult. And over the years, there were more than a few cases of ordinary Chinese who ended up talking to foreign reporters and then being detained or being sent to prison for this unauthorized contact. And there were also many cases of foreign reporters themselves who were called in and questioned by the police. There, again, Jeffrey doesn't have the notes on this, but there was one case which we discuss in the book where a reporter for the New York Times interviewed a young Chinese woman who told him about sexual values in China. And he wrote an article and he tried to disguise her identity, but he didn't do a good enough job, and so she was arrested. And he felt guilty the rest of his life that he didn't mean to, but he'd gotten this woman in trouble just for interviewing her about sexual values in China. Nonetheless, especially as throughout the 1980s and into the late 1980s, China did begin to open up, and it began to open up to the foreign press as Chinese society itself began to become 越来越开放, more and more open. Then you had the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in 1989, and the historic coverage by CNN and other broadcast networks. Now, the coverage of Tiananmen is fascinating because it was the result of an accident, a historical accident of history. The reason was that the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was going to visit China. For the Chinese government, this was a big deal. It would mean the end of the 30-year-long Sino-Soviet conflict. And for Deng Xiaoping, it was going to be the final achievement of his diplomatic career. He normalized relations with the U.S. Now he was going to reestablish good relations with the Soviets. So the Chinese authorities agreed when CNN and other international news agencies said, we want to make a big show out of this. This is a big story. And they agreed to give permission to bring in satellite equipment, other technology, to give additional visas for reporters and production personnel to come to China. But what happened was that the Gorbachev visit was supposed to happen in Tiananmen Square. That's where the official welcoming ceremony was going to be. But the student protesters literally stole the stage on which the Gorbachev visit was supposed to have taken place. But with the transmission equipment there, we broadcast it, and it went all over the world. You know, today it's possible to take out your iPhone and do a live broadcast. I could do a live broadcast from this room. They go all over the world. So it's easy to lose sight of how unprecedented the coverage back in 1989 was. It had never happened before, and it captured international attention. And what's more important is that it presented a very different picture of China than the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party had been working so hard to present. The party wanted to control the way China was shown to the rest of the world, and then suddenly, live on television, in Washington, in Taipei, in London, in Berlin, in Moscow, in Bangkok, people were seeing a completely different image of China. And then came the crackdown of June 4th, the Liu, which I covered for CNN. Now, there are 3 chapters in the book about June 4th, so if you want to know all the details, you have to buy the book. I should also say Liu is my birthday, so it was a very unusual birthday. But in any case, by the early 1990s, much of the foreign media remained focused on sort of the aftermath of June 4th and the tragedy of June 4th. And so it took a while for foreign journalists to begin to realize that Deng Xiaoping, despite the crackdown of June 4th, was reviving his program of economic reform. And this, especially in the sort of early mid-1990s. But then the attention of the press shifted very quickly to following these dramatic social and economic and even political changes that were caused by the China boom. And this new atmosphere with the focus on the economy also led to a significant improvement in conditions for foreign journalists. So it suddenly became much easier to travel, and local officials were much more willing to talk to you. You would go and they would say, yes, we'll give you an interview with the mayor. He'll talk about our investment promotion zone. Don't ask about June 4th, but if you want to talk about foreign investment, yes. So it became a much easier place to work, and by the late 1990s, the China assignment was entering what some of the correspondents that I interviewed described as a kind of golden age for covering China. And foreign journalists were able to sort of dig below the surface in Chinese society in ways that had previously been difficult, if not completely impossible. And it was a country, I like to call it, it's a country of paradox. What's the word in Chinese for paradox? Maoduan? Maoduan, yeah. Chairman Mao used to like to talk about it. Yeah, because one day you would be doing a story about a dissident who was being sent to jail, and the next day you'd be covering the opening of the world's largest airport. So how do you reconcile these two completely opposite trends in the same society? The climax of this period was 2008. And this is when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympic Games. And in the run-up to the Games, the government lifted many of the restrictions that had been in place for a very long time about the movement and activities of foreign journalists. And it became much, much easier to travel, to meet people, and to do your job. But after the Summer Olympics ended, the political climate inside China and China's external behavior began to change. My personal view is that the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 that really hit the US and the West was the key factor, and it led Chinese leaders to conclude that America and the West more generally were in decline. And so they felt it was the right time for China to show a more assertive face to the rest of the world. And so that included the way in which they chose to treat the foreign media. And what it meant was that for journalists, China became, and it remains today, an increasingly difficult assignment. Journalists have found themselves followed, harassed by police, blocked from doing interviews. Sometimes they've even been detained or physically assaulted and beaten up. It's not as closed off as it was during the time of Chairman Mao. But my own feeling is that, looking at it from outside China, and I have not been to China since 2017, but looking at the outside is that I think the situation now for China-based reporters is worse and more restrictive than at any time since the late 1970s. And then in the more recent years, you had the restrictions caused by all of the COVID lockdowns in China, which made movement extremely difficult. And then in the early days of COVID, in early 2020, the Chinese government expelled a couple of dozen American reporters, reducing the number very dramatically. And even today, many foreign journalists have trouble getting visas to go to China. So the result is that the size of the Foreign Press Corps, which was quite large, has shrunk very dramatically from what it was a few years ago. And that has meant increasingly having to cover China from outside the country. So one very interesting sign is the number of correspondents based here in Taipei who were in Beijing and were either kicked out or are sitting here waiting for a visa to go to China and they can't get the visa. So to me, it seems almost like a sort of modern day version of the China watching that we saw in Hong Kong in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s has become increasingly important again. As I mentioned, that coverage was based largely on reading and interpreting the official Chinese media, newspapers, radio broadcasts, documents. So it meant sitting at your desk trying to figure out the real meaning of the rhetoric, the jargon, the symbols, the slogans, the obscure historical references or statistics which may or may not be true, put out by the Communist Party. That's what we did when I started out as a journalist in Hong Kong in the mid-70s, and what people were doing for 20, 30 years before that. We're back to doing that again. Although today, reporters have tools that didn't exist back during the time of the older China watchers. One is monitoring the Chinese internet, which is an extremely useful tool, although it has problems, but it's a very useful tool. There's also commercially available satellite imagery, which has played a very important role in covering a lot of stories, because the satellites are up there, the Communist Party can't do anything about it, and you can learn all sorts of interesting facts from satellite pictures. And also, because China has such a big international role, it's involved economically and diplomatically in so many countries, it becomes possible to cover China's global or international role without being in China. But there still have been this sharp drop in the number of China-based correspondents, and even for the people who are there are still very strict limits on access. And that limits the ability of reporters to sort of go around the country and talk to people and dig beneath the surface and try and get a little bit better sense of the trends or the texture in Chinese society, which is so important. Because, you know, the essential foundation for good journalism is to be there yourself and witness it yourself. That's what you want to do as a journalist. And that has become increasingly difficult. And even when travel within China has become possible, the reporters today face a population that is much more hostile and much less friendly than it used to be. And the reason for this is that, especially in recent years, the state media has told the Chinese people that foreign journalists are bad guys, that we're spies. And so people are afraid to talk, or they're hostile. They don't want to talk, and they don't want their neighbors to talk to you as well. So you have this situation in which, even as the China story is becoming more and more important, it's becoming harder and harder to cover. And what that means is that the ability to kind of get at the richness of China, the diversity, the complexity, the sort of what we call the human interest stories, is much, much harder. And instead what you get are lots of stories about geopolitics and strategy and US-China relations, but you don't get nearly as much about what the Laobaixing in China are thinking or doing or saying. And that is something that to me is crucially important to understand about Chinese society, and it's becoming harder and harder for journalists to do. So to sum up, unfortunately, it's a kind of grim and depressing time in any discussion about foreign journalists in China. But my hope in doing this book, Assignment China, is that at least it makes a small contribution to helping people like yourselves get a better understanding of what it's like to do this work and the importance of doing this work, and will help you appreciate a little bit more what foreign correspondents have done over the years to provide the understanding of China that we so badly need. So let me stop there. I'm very happy to get any comments and questions you may have, and thanks for your attention.
好，在调查10月来的一些人，有没有人需要翻译的 ？Does anyone need translation or interpretation?
I tried to speak very slowly so you could understand my English.
需要英文还是中文？中文 ，OK。那等一下问题可以用中文问，也可以用英文问。那
都可以，
都可以。那我们需不需要把门开一点点？因为我们的这个氧气好像有点好，好，如果有需要关起来的话，或者调整再跟我说。那我们就先OK， 好。那我们就先看一下现场有没有人想要问。
是可以用英文，也可以用中文。
都可以。
Okay.
那我用英文好了。
OK.
Well, I just want to express appreciation for the book because I really like the format. Well, I have a short attention span, and this book has different sections, and all the reporters' words are very short and concise. I find it interesting. I can read it anytime, and it's fascinating. It's sometimes different from the history books we've read in Taiwan, and I find it a fresh perspective.
Oh, thank you.
And I have a question on China. Is it China watching? So now we're back to the China watching, but with technology aids and all that. But I've been reading that. So in Hong Kong in the 70s and so on, you interview refugees coming into Hong Kong. But now I read that the Chinese people going to the West, for example, even though they're overseas, they're still afraid of saying anything, critical of the Chinese government. So, is that line dead?
It's not dead. You have funny.
Oh, yeah. That's better. 首先要谢谢麦克这本书，它跟一般市面上大部分的这个历史书非常不一样。那问题是这个关于这个中国观察的事情。那现在在这个海外也有很多人，他们非常害怕跟记者互动嘛。对，那
对，我就是想说，因为我读到说，在海外，虽然他已经在海外了，可是因为中国政府还是会想要在海外去控制他，所以他们也即使在海外，他也不敢说真话了。所以这个对他们的调查，这个访问是不是会有困难？
一定有困难。Yeah. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. It depends partly on individuals. It depends partly on what kind of relationship they have with reporters. There are a lot of Chinese in Europe, in the States. So even if a small number are willing to talk, it's still some. And you have to be careful to protect the identities of people. So it's a challenge, but it's not. It just makes it difficult, but I don't think it makes it impossible. And it depends on people's individual circumstances and what somebody might be willing to talk about how their grandfather died of COVID after the lifting of the zero COVID, but might not be willing to say anything about Xinjiang, for example. So it depends a lot. It's a very mixed picture.
虽然这个非常的 非常的困难，但是还是有一些这个简单的方法，还是有一些基本方法可以做到。那它也很大部分取决于各个这个被访问的人跟各个这个记者之间的这个关系。就比如说有些人他们可能愿意讨论他们的家人因为这个 COVID-19 的过世的事情，但是他们可能会不愿意谈论新疆的事情，所以他可能会看说每个记者或者是每一个受访者他们之间的这个看法。
Also, I would just add, there are now a lot of journalists outside of China who have been in China before and who have good Chinese, and so it's you can develop a more comfortable relationship with somebody who could be a potential source than might have been true 10 or 20 years earlier.
所以现在也有很多记者，他们是之前住过中国，所以他们会有自己的管道可以得到他们的讯息。大概是。
You mentioned that being present in context in China is very important, and you mentioned that you haven't been back to China since 2017. Just going back a little bit, and you mentioned that in the 1990s it was the sort of the golden bloom period where everyone was very welcome. Yeah, to go. My question is actually, well, with more journalists or people who are interested in China, say if they're not white people or black, and say if they're like Asian American, does it make it any easier, for journalists like that to be present in China to do that kind of job?
Yeah, there's actually a section in the book that talks about the changing composition of the American press corps, because by the mid-teens, the number of people of Chinese origin, either people who've been born in China, his family had gone to the States, or born and raised in the States from Chinese descent, or Canadian Chinese, Australian Chinese, expanded very considerably. And they have a big advantage in China. It's an advantage and a disadvantage.
OK，记者他们的身份、他们的组成，对于这个报道中国有没有什么影响？那比如说他们的不同的种族或者他们不同的国籍，对于这个报道他们有没有什么影响？
So, because they look and often sound like a local person, they're able to get to places and see things and interact with people in a way that somebody who looks like me would never be able to do. So that's a huge advantage. And there are many stories in the book of experiences journalists had where because they were ethnic Chinese and they looked like locals, they learned about things and they got to places that other people would not have done. So on the one hand, it's a huge advantage.
那个就是在2010年代左右的时候，开始有在美国在外国记者在中国的，就是在中国的外籍记者的组成成分开始组成的族裔开始有一些明显的转变。那有越来很明显的就是亚裔但是具有欧美籍的，或者甚至本身可能是父母亲就是离开中国的这些人，他们在构成了相当多在中国的外国记者的比例增加了。那这个有带来了一些很明显的优势，但是也带来了一些劣势。那很明显的优势就是蛮多这些记者蛮多人，他们有语言能力，然后他们看起来当然也像本地人，那所以他们能够获得的资讯或者愿意跟他们聊的中国民众是远远的大于像迈克这样子明显就是看起来就是不像中国人的记者，但是he hasn't started to talk about the
but the negative part is because they look Chinese, they often get treated like local Chinese. So there's one very interesting story in the book by a journalist who works for the Los Angeles Times, who's now in Taipei actually. She went to内蒙古, to do a story about they were promoting the use of Putonghua at the expense of the Mongolian language. And she went to a school and she was waiting to interview people. And the police arrested her. They thought she was just a local. And they took her to jail, and she had a terrifying experience, which she talks about in the book. And she kept saying, I'm an American citizen, 我是美国记者, 我要给大使馆打电话. And it took like till the next morning. Finally, some official said, well, maybe we better check. And it turned out, oh God, it's really true. So they let her go. But she had an absolutely terrifying experience, and she didn't know what was going to happen to her. So the other side of looking like a local is that you get treated like a local, and often that can be very unpleasant.
但是另外一部分就是很也造成了某一些负面的效应，就是这些记者正因为他们不管在族裔上或者是外貌上面，就看起来就跟当地的中国人没有什么两样，所以有的时候他们所遭遇的对待就不像是一般的外籍记者，而反而是被当作是本地的中国国民来对待。就是他在书中有提到，有一位记者他去前往内蒙古去试图要报道，当地政府或者是学校机构要提升普通话教育而压抑蒙古语教育的时候，他是正要准备访问的时候，他就直接被逮捕了。然后他在被关押的时候，他就被拘留，然后他说他是美国人，他是美国公民，他是美国的媒体派来记者，但是当地的警方显然就是完全不理会他，直到了隔天他们才开始考虑到也许他讲的是实话的可能性，才开始去查证，然后最后才把他放出来。但对他而言，这是一个非常恐怖的经验。
那一段真的很精彩，对。
对，在这个书中有一个这个书中有一些章节是关于这个部分，请大家
就是那个房间是一个旁边被贴满那个应该是棉被吧，就趴在里面会尖叫，然后中间有一张那个叫老虎凳，就是它是一个椅子，然后可以把你的手这样子靠起来。然后那个警察还很好心说，哦，我们对你很好，我们不会让你用这一张。然后那个女生还是吓死，就是那是一个非常可怕的经历。然后这个记者非常的，
你记得给
我记得，而且我知道这个记者是谁。
那个棉被，我只有想到以前那个陈菊女士，她有展示给人家看那个在景美
人权博
物馆里面那些牢房也是这样，他们里面都是装满了软垫，它主要是怕你
自杀或者是
I have a lot of questions I want to ask, but I'll keep them very brief.
Okay.
So the first question is that with the restrictions that you mentioned earlier, what limitations, be that in topics or angles, do you think readers of American news or on China should be cognizant about nowadays when we consume these kind of news? The limitation. That's the first question. Second question is, what's, in your opinion, the best China watching location outside of China nowadays? Third question is, throughout your over decades of experience in the sector, best China watching outside of American news outlets? Because I imagine you might have encountered with media correspondents from other countries.
I think the most important thing is to be aware of what is not there, in the sense that, as I mentioned, much of much of the coverage now is 外交关系、中美关系、贸易战, these kinds of or China's 一带一路, and what you're not getting enough of is what's going on inside Chinese society. What are the trends? What are the things that people are concerned about? What is daily life like? And that's really important, because from that is going to produce issues and trends that will affect the direction of China. So when you look at the news, be aware that just because it takes up most of what's in the news, it's not most of what's happening, but that we can't get to a lot of what's happening. So I think it's just an awareness of the potential areas that are not given the attention they deserve that will give you some context.
不好意思，那个问题我没有听得很清楚。
那个
第一个问题是，
第一个问题其实主要就是说，因为现在有很多限制，那像我们在看美国媒体报道中国的时候，我们作为读者可能需要特别注意到有哪些点上，不管说是主题上或是角度上。那他刚才是说，就是说需要注意，那就主要需要注意就是没有被报道到的东西，因为现在大部分新闻都在讲地缘政治啊、贸易战，比较没有报道到中国社会、日常生活等等，那这些都会从中去产生影响中国的一些趋势。所以基本上不是说没有新闻，而是说我们没有机会报道到这些重要的事情。然后
对，
第二跟第三个问题是在问，现在从海外报道中国的最佳地点，麦克都会自己的，然后以及就是说他除了跟美国媒体互动以外，他跟其他国家媒体也有互动到。其实蛮好奇，从他角度上来讲的话，哪些其他国家媒体报道中国，他觉得是还蛮不错的。
Well, it's hard because there isn't one place that is ideal. Taiwan has a lot of very good qualities. First of all, it's a Chinese-speaking society. The mainland, everybody thinks about the mainland, talks about the mainland. There's still a lot of contact. There's a lot of information. But the problem in Taiwan is that the focus, the lens through which everybody sees it, is the cross-straits issue. And so, which is important, hugely important. But if you want to look at agriculture in Hebei or, urban renewal in Gansu or something like that, it's not so easy from here, even with all of the benefits. That's why you have people here, you have people in Seoul, you have people in Washington, you have people in Singapore, you have people in Hong Kong. There isn't one place like Hong Kong used to be. I think Taipei is closest to it, but it has this 缺点 that everything is seen through the, not everything, but a lot is seen through the cross-straits lens. So what it means for the consumer of news is you have to be much more engaged and active yourself in looking at, not just looking at what the story is, but what's the dateline? Who wrote it? What's their background? If it's coming from Washington, is it coming from a reporter whose beat has China experience, or is it coming from somebody who only covers the U.S. Congress? So the more informed you as a consumer of news can be about the media you consume, the more you'll be able to make sensible judgments about all this stuff that keeps coming at you. Sorry.
我可以快速翻译一下。
好。
对，那个 Mike 的说法就是说，没有一个地方是完美的。因为台湾主要这边的限制就是说，看中国主要是透过两岸关系来观察，尽管说这是非常重要。但假如说你想关注像是河北农业啊，或是说甘肃的一些都市一体化，那就比较困难。那首尔、华府、新加坡、香港都有人，基本上主要也是这个原因，因为没有一个地方。都是完美的，也没有任何一个地方像是以前的香港，台北可能是最接近，但也有自己的限制，所以他觉得说，作为读者的话，现在就是自己也要比较 active，要比较积极一点点，比如说去了解这个报道是什么时间去报道的，那记者可能是谁啊？那他主要报道是哪一个县这样子，那比较可能可以了解自己在阅读的这个资讯是从何而来。
That's a really
I didn't answer the last question. There are lots of good media. I would say that the place that the American media has very good some, the New York Times has very good coverage. The Wall Street Journal has very good coverage. I think the Economist magazine is brilliant. They do fantastic work on China. So if there was apart from any American media, or even if you don't read any American media, the Economist really does brilliant work on China. There was 2 years ago, the Economist did an 8-part podcast about Xi Jinping called The Prince. It's the single best thing that's been done about Xi Jinping in any media, in my view. So I strongly recommend The Economist.
纽约时报、华盛顿邮报都是一个非常好的媒体。那另外，麦克也觉得，经济学人，英国经济学人是一个非常非常棒的媒体。那应该是2年前吧，他们有一个新的这个 podcast 节目，它是这个有限，它只有8集吧。然后它是报道习近平的这个节目，然后它名叫 The Prince， 就是王子，就是有点像太子党那个意思，王子的东西。那在麦克的经验里面，这是一个非常非常关于习近平报道最杰出的报道系。那我也是这样认为的，刚好我们这地方是一样的看法。好，这样。
So, you talk about like nowadays that you can use a cell phone and have a live broadcast. That's very interesting. That's the revolution of the telecommunications in our time. But on the other hand, technology goes 2 ways. So China is also like using technology to do mass surveillance or like Great Firewall, trying to limit the information. And naturally, the journalists want to get information and try to transmit the information out. How do you feel about the current trend or the last few years? What's the China's effort on shaping the information or limiting the information to its people or to the outside world, or on the other side, like how the journalists try to survive or do things under this kind of situations?
Well, you've put your finger on the central theme. The central theme of this book is how over 80 years there has been a constant battle between foreign journalists trying to break through the controls that the Communist Party has imposed. And sometimes there's progress, and sometimes there's setbacks. Sometimes it's an open period, sometimes it's a closed period. But 这个基本的矛盾还存在。So that we're now seeing the latest version of that.
就是麦克认为，就是我们刚刚讲的那个资讯的流通，这个就是这本书的一个中心的主题。在过去这几十年间，其实就是很大的部分就是这些外国的记者怎么样的试图在中国的那样的一个环境之下，在中国共产党控制的环境之下，试图去获取跟了解中国必须的资讯。那反过来说，中国也一直持续的试图去管控，不管是对内或者对外的这些资讯。那我们现在正在体验最新的一个阶段。
Obviously, the technological controls that the Chinese government has are huge, and they have been very effective, but they're not 100% effective. And so, in spite of the controls, you still see quite a lot of good reporting and people who've been able to break through and report news that they haven't wanted to report. And Xinjiang is a classic example of this.
对，那就是当然像科技在过去这几年的科技发展，那以及中国共产党试图运用这些科技，确实是造成了相当程度的封锁，但他们不是100%完美的。那你仍然可以看到记者做出好的报道，然后想办法得到了他们需要，他们认为需要的被告知的资讯。那关于新疆的报道，大概是最近这一波这些中国共产党的压力之下产生出来非常好的结果之一。
Because there are 2 chapters in the book about Xinjiang, because in Xinjiang the government had extraordinarily repressive controls, technology and surveillance, and yet the foreign journalists broke through and were able to reveal to the world the scale of the detentions, the nature of the of the repression, and how they did it, how they evaded all of these controls. It's absolutely fascinating. As I say, that's why I put the 2 chapters in the book about it.
在这个书里面，大家还要买的话，赶快要买。里面有2个章节是关于在新疆的报道，跟他们记者如何去报道。因为在那样一个环境之下，中国大规模的进行了监控，然后还有他们的关押。那但是记者们他们是如何在他们自己的口述里面有提到说，他们是如何去避开这些限制性的手段跟压迫性的手段，仍然想办法去了解到在新疆所发生的这些事情，他们当地的少数民族、当地的民族如何是被压迫，然后大规模的关押是怎么样的在进行。那所以这个东西是他们的很重要的工作经验，也是很棒的成果。
I'll give you one example. A reporter for the New York Times made friends with a guy from Xinjiang who was exiled and living in the States. And this exile contacted his mother, who was living in some small town, and basically said, I have a friend and I'd like to send him to visit you. And the mother kind of figured it out. So the reporter took a plane that got into this small provincial town at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And it was a day like today, it was gray and rainy. So he had a hood and he had an umbrella. He got into the taxi. He went to this woman's house at 5:30 in the morning, so the police were not even awake yet. And he started interviewing her, and every few minutes he would take the memory chip from his recorder out, put it in his shoe, change it, and by 8 or 9 o'clock he had his interview, and he left before the police realized that she'd even had a foreign visitor. And he flew back to Beijing and he did his story. The government was furious, but he got an important story out about what was going on in Xinjiang. So the sometimes you know it's like what they call in the intelligence business tradecraft. I don't know how that translates into Chinese, but using techniques you wouldn't normally do to evade all these restrictions and get through to the people the government doesn't want you to meet.
所以在这些报道里面，其中有一个，他可以举出其中一个例子。当时有一个外国记者，他的联络对象是已经流亡在海外的一个住在新疆的人，然后他们的家人是在新疆一个省级的小镇，里面一个小镇里面。那他只是透过那个人就联络他自己的家人说啊，那个时候某一天早上5点多的时候会有一个朋友去拜访你，那他们家人我不太确定他刚讲是妈妈还是医生，他就说好，他就知道是什么状况。那这个记者就直接从北京，然后搭了飞机，5点钟就已经在当地落地，然后搭了车，然后当时下着雨，他就把那个帽子戴上，然后围起来，然后雨伞也打起来，然后等到他真的到了当地，真的成功到达当地，然后进行访谈。他每隔一小段时间，好像大概几分钟左右，他就一直换记忆卡，然后藏在袜子里面。然后那个时间点是天才刚亮，然后连警察都还未必进办公室。然后他在整个东西完成，等到8、9点的时候，他已经完成他的访谈，已经飞回北京。那他这些有的时候这些手法，就是已经到跟有点类似情报人会使用的一些小技巧或手法来去规避这些东西。那他们必须要采取这样的做法，才能够完成他们的报道。那等到警察8、9点真的上班的时候，发现有这个事情，他已经回到北京。
I have questions back to part of the nature of journalism. And so, since you've shared so much experience in China, and we tend to group all the foreign journalists, like the foreign correspondents, I'm also curious, do you have much interaction with the local journalists? And if so, if there anything you'd like to share, anything kind of beyond expectations or pleasant surprises from your experience? And also there's a follow-up question because I didn't know about your background. So you mentioned you left in 2017. So the second question is, since you left, what has been some of your surprises of how the journalism aspect of China, whether foreign or local, has evolved or changed?
Well, let me just be clear. I left CNN in 2006, so it's been almost 20 years since I haven't been working as a journalist. But my last visit to China was just a short visit to Beijing. It was in 2017. I had quite a lot of interaction over the years when I was working there with Chinese journalists. There were a lot of journalists, especially before, who really aspired to want to do journalism as we know it. They were very frustrated by having to work within a system that was so tightly controlled. Sometimes they would tell us things that they couldn't publish because they wanted the information out and they knew that we could. Not all of them, but sometimes. And there were, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, early mid-2000s, there were some quite good Chinese media outlets, particularly on economic issues, which were less politically sensitive. Caijing, places like that, did a lot of really good work. But they've all been squeezed today by this new emphasis on ideology. So I think today, I feel sorry for a Chinese journalist who maybe went to a Western journalism school and came back with hopes that they could see an advance in China becoming a more open society, and then see it going the opposite way. But we, foreign journalists certainly had contact with them. And there were some times, the most dramatic was during the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. And there's a part of a chapter in the book about this. There was a period of about 10 days or 2 weeks where the government essentially ignored all the controls on the press because they were too busy with the disaster. And so Chinese journalists and foreign journalists worked together, did the same stories, helped each other out, and the journalists I interviewed said that this was a deeply moving moment for them, and we saw how we were one. We were doing the same thing for the same purpose, and then of course the controls came back in and that stopped.
所以2006年的时候，麦克就先离开 CNN， 那2017年最后是到中国，那这个短短的时间在那个地方，所以它不是一个工作的性质。那他从以前就有很多中国的记者会想要透过外媒去把他们的声音传出来，因为他们没办法靠自己的媒体出来。那同时他们在当地也有很多很好的这个经济方面的报道，像比如财经这样的报道。那麦克也看到很多记者，他们受到西方教育以后，想要在中国把这个新闻价值的理念带到中国去做法，但是没办法好好的发挥。那最有这个印象最深刻的是在四川大地震的时候，那个时候政府太忙，没有时间管媒体这件事情，所以他们大概有10到14天的时间。中国跟外国媒体是可以好好的配合，那可以做很好的报道。那这个是让这个其中一个受访的这个记者非常非常感动的时刻，他们觉得这个才是我们好好适合报道的方式，这是一个非常这个戏剧性的这个部分。
Second question. Yeah. No, the second question. Since 2017.
Oh, since 2017? Well, I think the atmosphere has gotten much worse.
What I meant is things that's kind of beyond your expectation or that surprises. So I just assumed that got worse was kind of
I don't know whether it was a surprise or not. It's depressing, but you could already see the trends going back to 2012, 2013. It's a little surprising that it went quite as far as it did, but I think that's partly because people probably didn't really appreciate the priorities that Xi Jinping has, which are Communist Party control above everything else, including economic development. And if that means tightening the screws on everything, including both political and intellectual discourse in China and the presence and activities of foreign journalists, then that's what it is. and so I think it's, you know, it's quite extreme. And sometimes I don't think people appreciate how extreme the change has been. And I think in some ways we're going to look back on the period from the late 1970s to sort of 19 to 2012, 13, 14 as this kind of, you know, the Deng reform period, and that's finished now. Now we're into a completely different period, which is, I think, much darker for China.
所以问题大概是有没有这个离开中国有没有超出你预期的这个中国的发展？那麦克他提到一点是，他没有人们好像没有意识到现在的控制是多么的紧，所以这些控制是超过他们的经济的发展，超过他们这个人们的这个基本上的生活，所以这个是一个让这个中国回到很久前这个状况，所以这个是让麦克非常意外的事情。有没有？
Yes.
My question is about 妖魔化中国. You know, Chinese government or Chinese people, they always felt foreign media demonize China. And my question is, from a journalist perspective, do you think is there any possibility China can overturn such image? 我的问题就是，中国人都觉得他们被外国媒体妖魔化，然后中国有很多小粉红，他们 feel hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well, I don't know what journalists can do to change that. I think one of the problems is Western journalism, at its best, the role of Western journalism is to be a voice for people who don't have a voice, to shine a light into a dark corner where powerful interests don't want the light to be shined, to challenge established authority, and to give the citizens of a democracy the information they need to make intelligent decisions about their government and about their lives. Now, even in the West, this is an ideal. I don't pretend for a minute to think that this is the situation all the time, but it's the ideal. And when you talk about the journalists on the ground in China, the correspondents, most of them come out of this tradition. And it's important to make a distinction here. This is a book about field reporters in China. It's not a book about editors in Washington or editors and bosses in New York. The editors and bosses play a role, obviously. But the people who go to China as journalists have these values. And they would have these values whether they were in Beijing or in Tel Aviv or in Moscow or in London or in Nairobi or in Taipei or in Delhi. And that's why so many governments don't like the press. It's not just the Chinese government. And they always say, oh, the press has a bias against this or for that. In general, I think journalists are cynical about authority. They don't automatically accept everything they're told. They want to see it for themselves. And then they apply standards and principles of how you assess information to give the reader the clearest, most comprehensible picture. And then the reader makes up their mind.
所以这个麦克提到这个西方媒体的这个精神的传统是这个为这个无声者发声，然后把光照到有人不想被照到的地方，然后让资讯可以在这个民主社会中流通，让人民可以做选择。所以这大概是西方民主的这个西方媒体这样的传统。但是即使在西方，这个东西也不见得是永远都成立，这个毕竟还是个理想性的东西。那一个值得一提的点是，这本书里面提到大部分的记者，他们都是实际在中国做报道的，他们不是在纽约，不是在华盛顿的那些编辑，他们可能就是对当地情况没有那么，他们是实际在这个中国这些人，所以他们是带着这样子的理想到中国去的。那也因为这个媒体这样的性质，就是让这个为无声的发声，把这个光照不想被照的地方，所以也不是只有中国他们讨厌媒体，因为很多国家他们都对媒体不是这个非常的友善。那这个所以这个是我漏掉什么？也差不多。
So in China, you have a system where the role of the media is the mouthpiece for the government. The media's role in China is to promote the government's policies, and the media's role and the Western media's role is to find out the reality, whatever the government's policies. And so it's a basic maodun. It's a clash, it can see, and then you also have a culture in China that doesn't like foreigners washing China's dirty laundry in public, like any society. So there's room for tension, but when people say, oh, the foreign media hate China, they're anti-China, I don't hate China. I spent my whole life studying Chinese. I moved to China with a wife and a baby and a dog, and I lived there for 8 years, and I love China, and Chinese people are great, and I think if you talk to most journalists, they would have the same feeling. But that doesn't mean they love the Chinese system, especially when the system is constructed to prevent journalists from finding out the truth. So it's just a built-in tension. But I don't think people go to China and say, oh, I hate China, I'm going to do something terrible, they're such horrible people. It doesn't work that way. That's a completely inaccurate perception of the attitude of journalists.
所以在中国的他们官方是希望媒体当他们的这个政策的传声筒，那希望记者是带着这个想要挖取真相的这个心态过去，所以他们本身就有这个矛盾在。那当地的人民其实也不见得会喜欢美国的记者在那边挖掘他们的生活的这个细节这样子。那很多这个记者，包括麦克可能他们本身都非常喜欢中国，也喜欢那边的生活，但是他们不见得喜欢的是那个地方的系统，然后不喜欢被这控制，然后不希望他们的工作受到阻碍，所以这个大概是这样的状况。
Recent years we're finding out about the Chinese extending their repressive tactics overseas with like Confucius Institute or these covert overseas police headquarters. Has that affected any, for example, you're saying much of the reporting now has to be done outside of China. So now with these sort of university students spying on other university students, for example, overseas.
Well, obviously it makes some Chinese more cautious, but it also gives journalists who are working on China-related stories who are not in China fresh material. If Chinese police are patrolling the streets of Budapest, then you can do a story about Chinese police patrolling the streets of Budapest. And what does that tell you about China's external behavior and China-Hungary relations and all of these kind of things? So I think in general the expansion of China's international role is a very important kind of beat. And there are news organizations now who have dedicated correspondents based in London or in Washington or New York or wherever, or Singapore even, and their primary coverage area of responsibility is China in Southeast Asia, China in Africa, and so on. For good reason.
所以问题在这个孔子学院这样的机构对于报道这个有没有什么影响？那这个中国的在世界各地的影响力现在是一个重要的报道的这个面向。那比如说这个在布达佩斯如果有警察在中国警察这边巡逻的话，那可能说明了布达佩斯跟中国之间关系有什么样的变化之类的。所以这个是大概是中国影响力目前的这个报道的这个状况。
In the past time, some people believe that China's economic development will lead to democratic and openness in China. Did you or the other foreign journalists believe that, or did you think there was a possibility for such change in China in the past time?
I think quite a lot of journalists were quite hopeful at various points that China, not that China would become a Western-style democracy, but that it was becoming a more open, somewhat more normal society where the Communist Party didn't have as much control over people's day-to-day lives At various times, I think, yeah, if you look at the coverage, it was very optimistic at different periods. But it was not guaranteed that this is the outcome. I mean, things happen in China. There were political forces at work, and some came out on top, and some lost, and it might have been different had the circumstances been different. So yes, I think, and it comes out in the book in some of the comments that people have about how hopeful people were at various stages, and then how the hopes were dashed by what happened.
问题是大概这个经济的发展会不会对这个民主化有帮助？那麦克认为他不见得会变成是，他们不见得是想象的是这个西方这样的民主国家，但至少是一个比较正常的国家，不会有这么多的控制，不会控制到生活上每个细节。那在不同的时期都会看到记者有这样子的这个乐观的一面。那这个不是麦克说的，我自己觉得在天安门广场那一段是我觉得最精彩的一点，就是大家看到那个西方记者看到这么多中国人，他们想要为他们民主制度做，不见得民主，但为了他们新的政府做一个新的努力。你会看到这些记者是多么的乐观，多么的觉得哇，这个中国要改变了。然后接下来就是这个大事件了嘛，然后每个记者都觉得这样的，很多记者因为这个事件太痛心了，所以就离开这里。所以这个，那3个 chapter 非常的精彩的。
Yeah, Tiananmen is a very good point. There were certainly reporters who, before the crackdown, before martial law, every day there were 1 million people marching through Tiananmen saying, we want democracy, we want reform, we want 新闻自由, and so on. It was hard not to think something was going to change. And I was no genius, but I was always very pessimistic. From the very beginning, I didn't think that was going to happen. And I was amazed that it went on as long as it did. But there were a lot of reporters who were absolutely convinced it was going to be like, do you remember in 1986, the People Power movement in the Philippines? Which I covered for CNN, which I was there, where, it's a huge peaceful movement, and in the end the military backed off and the dictator fled, Marcos, and Philippines became a democracy. And there were people who thought, how can you have this huge protests and not have some political progress? What they didn't appreciate was the Chinese Communist Party will do whatever is necessary, even if it involves killing its own people, to stay in power. And that, to me, was a very powerful lesson.
当年这个每天都有100万人就是参加游行，他们要民主化他们国家等等之类，所以当时那个情况真的很难想象说，真的没有东西会改变嘛？真的世界就会像以前那样吗？所以当时是一个这个非常乐观的这情况。那麦克他刚报道完那个菲律宾的状况，那他对这件事情是比较悲观的。那最后是谁证明说中共他们会尽其所能把这个他们想要的方向做确定，不会允许这样的挑战。所以这个是当时这个其中一个记者对这个情况乐观的有些变化的这个。
I got 2 questions, and I'm curious about your experience of your career. And the first one is, you mentioned earlier that the normal people in the Chinese society, they are gradually unwilling to share their voice, and the reporters sometimes are hustled about you. Yeah. So, but in the news, the beginning of the news always quote the high level of the officer from China say something. So, how do you verify the information you got? And the second one is the people who are willing to share the information. What do they have? Do they have something in common, like the ideology of some personality?
Well, I mean, first of all, what government officials say is news, so journalists will report it. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means the fact that they said it is news. And obviously, depending on what it is they say, it's part of the journalist's job to provide some background and context. So if Xi Jinping issues an important statement on U.S.-China relations or on Taiwan, that's going to be the news. But getting at what the Laobaixing's daily lives are like is much harder. It's always been hard, but it's harder now because you can't get out and sink into the society in the same way. It was never easy, but it was easier at different stages. If you wanted to go and spend 10 days in a village somewhere, you could usually get permission to do that, and then you could write a series of stories about life in the village. That's much harder to do now. And in terms of the other, I don't know, as I say, I think a lot of it comes down to how much energy you as consumers of news put into becoming sophisticated consumers of news. So when you see a story, don't just read it and say, oh, that's what happened. Analyze the story. What was the opening sentence? Who were the experts quoted? Where was the story written? What's the dateline? Is it Seoul? Is it Taipei? Is it Beijing? Is it Washington? Google the reporter. Oh, this reporter was in China for 10 years, and so they may know something. Oh, this reporter worked for a local TV station in Philadelphia and may not know anything. So there are things you can do to become more knowledgeable about the news reports that you're getting. And part of the value of this book, and part of the reason I wrote the book, is hopefully for people to have that, to give people that kind of understanding about the news and the reporters who do the news from China. So that the next time, a lot of the people in this book, especially in the back half of the book, are still writing on China. So if you read this book, then the next time you see a byline by somebody, you'll say, oh, that person, there's a guy named Chris Buckley, who maybe some of you know his name. He's the main New York Times China correspondent. He's a brilliant, brilliant journalist. And he's based in Taipei now. And he was in China for 20 years. And he was in Wuhan for the entire COVID epidemic. He went in when everybody left, and he stayed. And then they kicked him out. So when Chris Buckley writes something, I take it very seriously. This is a guy who knows what he's talking about. So if you can get your own level of appreciation of who these people are, what their background is, and study the way in which the stories are done, rather than just saying, oh, Xi Jinping said this today. Let's analyze the whole story. I mean, as a journalist, that's what I do on every story that interests me. And it helps you get a better sense of what's really going on beyond just what the headline is.
大概是说这个怎么样验证新闻报道的内容。那比如说新闻报道可能会说某某官员说了什么话，那怎么知道这是真的假的？那官员说的话，在麦克意见里面大部分都应该把它当新闻看，因为他是官员讲的话。那但是老百姓的话可能就比较难验证，那也比较难知道说这个是真的还是假的。那以前会稍微容易一点，可以得到一些老百姓的资讯，就比如说以前可能可以花个10天的时间在一个小村里面去这个理解这个小村的人民在想什么，但现在是越来越难做这件事情。那所以我们在看新闻报道的时候，应该要这个更有这个分析性，然后更有这个去理解说它新闻是怎么样产出的，然后它的背景是什么。像比如说，我们刚麦提到一个应该叫楚百亮吧，他现在住在台北。那他之前在武汉待过，那个时候是那个肺炎最兴盛的时候，然后书里面有提到那个故事里面，就一个中国的官员一直打电话跟他说，请你赶快离开，你已经玩够了，已经在这边没什么好做的事情，请你赶快离开，你已经这个很危险。到最后他们好像有一个这个非常深的这个连结，就是这个中国的官员他一方面这是可以听得出来是真的在担心楚百亮他的健康状况，楚百亮也说我就是要聊到这里，我就是要把这个报道做出来，所以麦克说他只要看到楚百亮报道，他就可以先相信80%。麦克没有这样讲，但是他说他的报道是这样子的相信。所以这也是麦克他写这本书的其中一个原因，就是他希望可以让大家知道说这个新闻怎么样被做出来，然后让你可以有些方法去分析你看到的内容。大概。
time for maybe one or two more.
Yeah.
I'm in no rush, but yes.
You talked about Caixin and Caijing, and they have like English versions as well. Caixin and Caijing,
Yeah.
right? They have English versions of their papers as well.
Mhm.
Do you think that we can still believe in the story that they write and believe that they're not affected by the Chinese government? Not just Caixin and Caijing, and also like South China Morning Post,
Right,
like which
yeah.
is like now.
Well, what was Ronald Reagan's favorite line? Trust but verify. You know, you have to realize there might be very interesting information, and it might even be true. I wouldn't automatically accept it as true simply because it's in, especially in the mainland press. The South China Morning Post is interesting because they still try and present themselves as being slightly more independent, but there are clearly areas they won't go. So again, I think it comes down to being aware of, you know, putting what they put out into some context. It requires more work on your part than just passively read. But if Caijing has a story about, you know, the housing prices, you know, there's no way to automatically verify the facts, but the fact that they have a story already tells you something. So then you have to ask yourself, why are they doing it now? What else is going on in housing policy? Have the banks just announced some big new initiative? Is there a, you know, is the Liang Hui is coming up this month, so there'll be all sorts of policy stuff that is going to get decided. So is this somebody putting this out before the Liang Hui? So you have to keep kind of, this is not conspiracy theories. This is just analyzing the context in which stuff that comes out in an environment where the media is either controlled directly or indirectly, in the case of the South China Morning Post, indirectly by the state, and putting it in some context. Why are they saying it now? You know, whose interest does it benefit for it to be said now? Who did they quote? What's the data? So it requires more work, but the payoff from doing the more work is a much deeper understanding of what's going on.
问题大概是现在财经这些过去可以相信的报道，现在还可以相信吗？那麦克的说，他引用了这雷根的名言是这个 trust but verify， 就是你可以相信他，但是你要自己去验证这样子。那这个很大一部分是你要去看说这个东西它阐述的脉络是什么。那这个比如说可能看他这东西被看出来，他就不会是完全没有这个无中生有的跑出来，那可能代表的是什么会要来了，或者是这个什么人他们可能需要释放这样什么样的讯息，然后让大家知道可能要造成一些什么样的效果。所以这个后面的分析是需要花时间，但他的这个你会得到报酬，是你可以对这东西更深入的了解。好，还有没有现场？简单问一下，好，这边现场有没有这个做新闻媒体或者是相关产业？
我大部分都是帮记录国外的纪录片当摄影师之类的，对，都去。
纪录片，然后那边有一个是 Focus Taiwan 啊 ，OK， 爱了什么？OK， 终于见面了。
Well, I'm happy to stick around and chat, and if anybody wants to buy a book, I'm happy to sign it. And
How about you already bought it?
you already bought it. Okay, good for you. Thank you.
好，那我们现场没有其他的问题。
Well, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you find the book interesting.